and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With us are Neil Midgley, media writer at the Daily Telegraph, and entrepreneur Scott Fletcher. Good to have you both here tonight. Let's take a look at tomorrow's front pages then. Here's the Mail's headline: Champagne perks of NHS drugs watchdog NICE. It says that the body has spent around £115,000 on expenses which have come out of the NHS budget. The paper says these splurges are coming at a time when NICE is banning new drugs on the grounds that they're too expensive. The Express has a positive headline with the good news that we're all going to live longer. According to the Office for National Statistics, we're going to live an extra 8 years, men up to 87 and women up to 90. The Independent continues its theme of the corruption of Britain with a secret report into how they say the criminal justice system has been infiltrated by organised crime gangs. The Independent's sister paper, The Eye, has the battle begins for the soul of the NHS, pitting Labour and the Conservatives against each other as the two parties start to set out their stalls ahead of the general election. The Telegraph has a picture of the French president's alleged mistress, the actress Julie Gaillet, in a backless red dress. The Times also has a picture of the same French actress with the headline, "Oui, Mr. President," as well as Labour's plan to improve the teaching profession. And finally, The Guardian leads with benefits chaos will lead to a new housing crisis. Well, that's where we'll start with The Guardian, saying that the universal credit is a time bomb which will lead to a rise in homelessness. This is a warning to Whitehall.
Yes.
Neil.
Well, The Guardian have put both the words crisis and time bomb in quotes in their headline and their stand first. I can't find either of those words in the quotes that they used in the story. Maybe they're further down inside the paper. It does seem to me one of those things to be scared of stories that aren't necessarily going to come true. The idea of universal credit, of course, is that it will replace a panoply of benefits, including housing benefit. And the idea, obviously, is to make work always pay, which is a great thing to do. But what in principle, what private landlords are apparently saying, and there are several of them quoted in this story, are saying that if they can't get the money direct from the government, as they often do on housing benefit now, that they will stop renting flats and houses out to benefit claimants.
Because it requires the benefit claimants to budget and
yes.
hand over their monthly rent.
Yeah, and that's also part of Ian Duncan Smith's scheme, is that the benefit will be paid monthly rather than weekly, which obviously will save on administration costs.
But some people find it very difficult to manage a monthly budget, don't they, if they've been used to working on a weekly wage?
Yeah, I mean, I think this story, I'm torn, because I think, on the one hand, people should take responsibility for their own money and their own budgeting. But on the other hand, if this leads to private landlords pulling out of this sector, then, I mean, we were talking earlier about building new houses, and this will just exacerbate the problem. So, it could be one of those stories where, like you say, setting alarm bells ringing, but maybe there's something in it that we do need to be careful about the way it's rolled out.
When you drill down into the detail, you get to the end of the story on the front page. As far as I can see, there's no difference in the way that landlords are going to be treated under the government's current plans for universal credit. So if 2 rent payments are missed, that's the current trigger for housing benefit to be paid direct to the landlord. And apparently it's going to be the same under universal credit. So what these people are complaining about apparently is the message that the government is somehow sending out.
But who's complaining here? Is it the landlord?
Private landlords, yeah.
And they house 1 million people.
Yeah, and we have to remember a lot of these private landlords are, maybe have 1 or 2 houses, and if they're reading these sort of headlines, then they may just decide to leave it all alone. And I rented into this sector many years ago. One house I moved out of when I moved south for a while, believe it or not, and I had a real problem with the council in collecting the rent because they didn't pay me direct at the time.
Yeah.
And, so you can understand how maybe some of these smaller landlords, that they're people like you and me who are just trying to rent out maybe second properties, and this sort of headline could put them off renting to the social sector.
But you're sceptical that it'll even come to fruition, that this problem will even happen, because the mechanism will ultimately be the same.
As far as I understand it, the mechanism will be the same. So as far as I understand it, at the moment, all things being equal, you get your housing benefit paid to you, the claimant, and you then pay your rent with it. If your landlord tells the government that you've missed 2 payments, then they get the money direct from the government. And as far as I understand it from this story, that's going to be the same under the government's current plans for universal credit.
Let's move on and look at the Times. Labour will tell teachers to improve or face a sack. Well, we've just been hearing from the National Union of Teachers just a few moments ago. We were speaking to Kevin Courtney, their Deputy General Secretary, and his concern with this is that it won't go hand in hand, Scott, with teachers being offered proper, high-quality professional development throughout their career. You can't sort of pull the ladder up without offering people the opportunity to improve.
Absolutely. I mean, the headlines here are talking about the NUT guy earlier was saying he waits to hear that detail. And I think, though, in any profession, then there should be that continuous improvement. I think we should be holding teachers to account on the quality of what they're delivering. I mean, I've spoke a lot about young people, and getting them into apprenticeships and teaching our young kids about computer coding and, maybe not focusing on things like handwriting, but maybe typing, so that we can compete with some of these these other countries around the world who really put those skills into kids. And if our teachers can't offer those skills through the system to the young people, then maybe we do need to start putting things in place to monitor it.
I just wonder what Labour thought it was doing while it was in power for 13 years. It's interesting now that we've got a fixed term parliament and we know that there's an election coming in less than 18 months' time. Suddenly these very voter-friendly, no-nonsense policies are starting to come out. We've got Andy Burnham in, the Shadow Health Secretary, in another of the papers, talking about plans for the NHS.
Doesn't mean, though, that any of these policies they're talking about now will actually be in their manifestos come the day, does it?
It doesn't. But Labour has just no history of trying to improve teaching during its last stint in power. I mean, to my mind, the devaluation of state education and the consequent decrease in social mobility were the biggest crime of Labour's time in office.
Well, aren't they entitled then to try to get it right this time, to do something a little bit more robust and to say to parents, we recognise that something needs to be done to weed out the weakest?
Well, they are, and I think I'm probably, in my turn, then entitled to be a bit sceptical about whether they actually will.
Well, they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't.
Well, in the face of inevitable, I mean, the teaching unions are not... If this would genuinely lead to bad teachers being fired, the teaching unions simply will not stand for it.
But not just bad teachers, but actually getting the skills into the teachers that we need for a modern society and a modern skilled young person.
But the point that the NUT were making is that lots of people realise that teaching's not for them. They don't need to be sacked. They recognise it for themselves and they exit the profession. But these figures don't tell you about those people who make the decision for themselves.
Absolutely. We'd have to ask our teachers about that. I mean, that would be... they manage those skills, and I think at the end of the day, I'll keep going back to it, but we need to teach our kids the right things for industry.
Let's look at the couple of stories here. The story of the French President François Hollande's alleged affair with an actrice hits several of the front pages. The Times shows Julie Gaillet giving a very Gallic shrug, whereas the Telegraph, shows a little bit more of her to us in a rather glamorous dress there. We can see her tattoo as well. This is it's a very interesting story, isn't it, looking at it from Britain? Because we get rather vexed about these things. And traditionally, the French have just allowed politicians to get on with things privately and not worry too much. It seems to be changing.
It does, and it's interesting to think how it would play out, how this kind of story... We haven't had a good political sex scandal for quite a while now, have we? I mean, when you think about going back to the good old days of the last Tory government and David Mellor and his Chelsea kit, and we had some great tabloid.
Yeah, I remember those days.
We had some great tabloid stories. I mean, this girl, to my mind, needs a roots done, but.
She needs a roots doing. That's the only comment you have.
But she's not dressed in Chelsea kit. I mean, the French, they have a much more glamorous je ne sais quoi.
They did step out for croissants.
Yeah.
They sent,
they didn't.
They didn't.
They sent
Okay.
a security guard.
Okay.
Bodyguard went out to fetch croissants.
Do we actually know it was him yet? I mean, apparently he was in his
he's not
helmet,
denied it, has he?
Okay, well, maybe.
I think he would deny it.
Yeah.
But it's social media have made this a much bigger deal in France. I mean, the television stations are still leaving it well alone because of the privacy laws. But just as we've seen here, social media, it all takes on a life of its own.
You can't control it now, can you?
No.
No, not so easily anyway. They might try. The Daily Mail. Champagne perks of NHS drugs watchdog. This is nice. The people who decide which drugs we're going to get and what can be afforded. Apparently, having spent £115,000 on taxpayer-funded credit cards in the past 2.5 years. This is the kind of thing that really gets people's goat, doesn't it? Because we're supposed to be in a time of austerity, and it looks as if people are spending money on luxury items at the taxpayer's expense.
Well, it's a great headline, isn't it? But when you read the story, actually, £115,000 over 2 years and only £5,000 spent on luxury hotels. There's about 200 quid a month spent on hotels, £50,000 a year spent on credit cards. People have expenses that they use these credit cards on. But I think the bigger story, as you read further down, is actually there's 137,000 of these in circulation.
These credit cards.
Yeah, exactly.
Government-funded credit cards. I mean, I can't imagine under current circumstances there are many, I mean, you probably know better than me, many private sector employers who are dishing out credit cards to their staff for expenses.
1.1 billion spent on those 137,000 credit cards. So that is a huge amount of money. And how they manage that and how they claim it.
You need a whole new staff, don't you, just to go through the bills every month?
Well, maybe they should switch to the way most of the private sector do it, and also, people put it on their own personal credit cards and claim it and justify it.
Does it mean that the bill comes down though?
Possibly.
Well, the bill comes down to the extent that if the item is on someone's personal credit card, then the onus is on them to claim it back from the employer. If someone puts something a bit dodgy on a card which has been issued and paid for by their employer, in this case the government, it's much more difficult for the employer then to try and claw that back from the employee.
Well, it's already been spent, hasn't it, at that point?
Yeah, the money's gone.
I hope they're listening. Very good ideas. The Express. Britons to live 8 years longer. Great news, says the front page.
Is it?
I don't know, I feel quite tired just reading that. We will be top of the lifespan league. Do you want to be, Neil?
Well, it says we're going to live 8 years longer. Men will live to the age of 87 on average. I mean, I'm just looking forward now to my life between the ages of 79 and 87 and wondering if those brilliant 8 years are actually great news and that it's so fantastic.
I'm really pleased that you're making plans already.
How's your pension looking for those years? Because I don't think any of us really, and that's that. Exactly. I mean, this is the big issue here is how do we afford pensions and the NHS? You know, a lot of the other headlines about the NHS and the costs rising and etc. and how we're going to manage that. You know, and this just basically gives us a bigger problem. But maybe the fun bit in the story is we will be underwater by then because we seem to have on the front page here Paul Daniels' house underwater.
Yes, we'll have a look at him in a minute if we can. But as you say, there's so many implications about us all living longer. I mean, the impact it's going to have on the NHS. And we're already seeing the state pension age is being pushed up and up and up. I mean, it's great if you're healthy, but it's all about quality of life as well.
And again, there's a public-private sector thing here because obviously private sector employers now almost entirely offer defined contribution pensions, which means that what you put in dictates what you get out, whereas public sector employers still giving defined benefit pension schemes, which means that they promise you a certain amount on retirement, which is literally writing a blank cheque on behalf of the poor old taxpayers, again in the private sector.
And that would be a huge cultural change if they were to change that over in the public sector.
Well, I mean, we've seen that at the BBC. There was a massive, there were strikes and a very great deal of anger here at the BBC when the management tried to change the pension scheme a couple of years ago.
They did change it.
And they did change it. In the end, they did change it. They didn't change it as radically as they initially proposed.
And many of these pension schemes haven't actually got a fund to fund them, so we're going to pay out of
I mean, that was the difference with the BBC, was that they actually did have some assets to pay.
And some of the councils have their own funds, but most...
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was the problem. There was a deficit.
But what I will say is that we're always complaining, aren't we, that we're never at the top of a league table. It looks like we're going to be.
Yeah.
But we still won't be happy.
We're going to be miserable for longer.
I look forward to being miserable with you. Another story on the Daily Express, which Scott just referred to here, is Paul Daniels and his wife Debbie McGee live in what would normally be probably a very beautiful house on the banks of the River Thames, and you can hardly see a lot of it because it's underwater.
It reminds me of Tywyn in North Wales when the banks... going back about 20 years and all the caravans are underwater. I mean, that's what the photo looks like.
It does look like at first sight, doesn't it?
And I assume this is in a very wealthy area.
It's such a sad picture. There's two little topiaried hedges that look like corkscrews that clearly one's
lopsided.
One's on each side of the front door, and they're just sort of, they've just been knocked over to one side in a...
But if you're going to live next to the Thames...
Well, I know it's what a lot of people aspire to doing. I'm sure a lot of people were thinking about whether that's really a very sensible idea until we get the flood defences sorted out.
And should the rest of us be paying for flood defences for Millionaires Row? Question mark.
Ooh, controversial.
I think, fortunately, we don't have time to tackle that one. I'm going to very quickly go back to the Daily Telegraph. Pressure for a perfect wedding, threatening marriage itself. The growing pressure on couples to have a perfect and very expensive perfect wedding has become one of the biggest threats to marriage itself. This is Lord Williams, Rowan Williams, who's of course the former Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm sure he and the current Archbishop have been saying something similar. I mean, you lose sight of why you're getting married when you sort of bog down in, you know, what your dress is going to be like, how big the cake is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Christmas, isn't it? It started off being a religious, in this case, ceremony for Christmas celebration, and it's become this great sort of consumer festival. Of course, come March of this year, we're going to start having gay weddings. And if you think straight people have had a massive hoopla and have put themselves under a lot of pressure, wait till you see the kind of extravaganzas that we gays are going to subject you to.
You've done it. You've managed to say gay man from
Gay
Leeds.
gypsy wedding, I mean, where could we go?
But there's a huge business opportunity for people in weddings, Scott. Massive.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, one of the things I'd say about weddings, you know, nowadays for young people, what's in it for them? You know, and we don't have a tax system that supports marriage. There's all this cost going with it. Yeah. So I think, you know, we've got to look at that. Do we want the family unit to be something as a country we support or not?
A case for eloping, perhaps.
Maybe.
I didn't suggest it. That's it for the papers tonight. It's been très amusant, I think we can say, can't we? Thank you to Neil and thank you to Scott. Thank you very much. Hope you'll come back again. You've got to.
You'll have me.